The funeral took place beneath a gray, endless sky, the kind that seemed to mourn alongside the living. The small wooden church sat silent, surrounded by fields that once echoed with laughter. The widow's coffin rested at the front, simple and unadorned, like the life she had lived, honest, quiet, and full of grace. The cowboy stood beside it, hat in hand, his face unreadable. He was known as the silent man of the valley, a husband of few words, a father, even fewer. Yet behind those weathered eyes burned a storm that no one could see. His sons, dressed in black, stood nearby, tall, proud, and bitter. To them, their father's silence wasn't strength. It was weakness. As the preacher spoke, the eldest leaned to the younger and whispered something cruel. A few heads turned when laughter broke the silence, muffled but sharp. They mocked their father's stillness, his inability to speak his grief, calling it cowardice beneath their breath. To them, emotion was a flaw, but to the man standing before the coffin, it was sacred, something too heavy for words. The townsfolk pretended not to notice, but the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Dust swirled through the open doorway as the wind picked up, like the land itself was restless. The cowboy said nothing. He didn't raise his head or his voice. Instead, he placed one rough hand on the coffin's edge and bowed his head, his silence louder than their mockery. In that single gesture, there was love, regret, and the kind of sorrow that could break a man's heart without making a sound. And then, from the back of the church, a small cry broke through the stillness. A young native girl, no older than 12, stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. No one knew who she was or why she was there. But she looked at the cowboy, not with pity, but with understanding. Her sobs carried what his silence could not. In that moment, the laughter of his sons died in their throats. Her tears spoke the truth that no sermon ever could. That love, real love, doesn't need words to be heard. The cowboy finally lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and something in the room shifted. The air, the light, even the way the wind moved outside. It was as if the world itself paused to bear witness. For the first time, the townsfolk saw not just a silent man, but a soul carrying the weight of loss with unshakable dignity. And though he said nothing, everyone there understood. Some hearts speak through silence, and some truths are only revealed through tears. The days after the funeral passed in a heavy silence that blanketed the ranch like dust on forgotten wood. The cowboy rose before dawn, just as he always had, moving through his chores with mechanical precision. But the rhythm of his life had changed. There was no longer the sound of her voice humming by the kitchen window, no gentle laughter when he came home covered in dust, no soft hand to steady the weight he carried inside. The house felt colder now, not because the wind had grown harsh, but because the warmth that once filled it was gone. His sons, bitter and restless, did not stay long. They had come for the funeral out of duty, not devotion. They spent the days drinking in town, their grief drowned beneath pride and whiskey. When they returned, they spoke only to each other, avoiding their father's gaze. To them, his silence was proof of indifference, as if love could only exist when shouted aloud. He didn't even cry, the eldest said one night. Did he ever love her at all? The younger one didn't answer, but his eyes mirrored the same cold doubt. The cowboy heard their words, though they never spoke them to his face. Each sentence cut deeper than any blade, reopening wounds the earth had barely covered. Yet he said nothing. Instead, he walked the same worn path to the hill where his wife now rested. He stood there for hours, his hat in his hands, whispering to the wind things no one else would ever hear. The land, vast and empty, became his confessional, and the stars his witnesses. The native girl who had wept at the funeral began appearing at the edge of the property. At first, she watched from a distance, silent as the dusk. She was an orphan of the plains, a child who had lost her people to sickness and time. The cowboy didn't know her story, but something in her eyes felt familiar, that quiet understanding of loss too deep for words. One evening, when he saw her again, he simply nodded. No questions, no demands, just acknowledgement. One grieving soul recognizing another. As the sun set behind the mesas, the girl approached the fence and placed a small bundle of wildflowers by the gate. Then she turned and disappeared into the growing night. The cowboy stood there, staring at the flowers, rough, imperfect, yet full of life. He didn't know her name, but her gesture reached him in a way his son's presence never could. For the first time since the funeral, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt like understanding. The next morning, the cowboy found the girl sitting on the fence, her small legs swinging as she watched the horses graze. She didn't speak, and neither did he. Words, he knew, often did more harm than good. He offered her a piece of bread and a seat by the fire, and she accepted with a nod. Over the following days, she returned, always quiet, always respectful. She helped feed the chickens, carried water, and followed him as he mended fences. To the cowboy, her presence was a strange kind of mercy, a reminder that not all silence came from grief. Some silence carried healing. When the townsfolk noticed the girl at his ranch, whispers began to spread. Some said the cowboy had gone mad from loneliness. Others claimed he had taken pity on a wild child. But the truth was simpler. He saw in her what he had lost. Not a wife, not a family, but the sense of belonging that death had stolen from him. And in turn, the girl saw in him something she had never known. Protection without possession, kindness without expectation. Two souls, scarred by life, slowly learning to breathe again in each other's company. The sons, however, didn't see it that way. When word reached them in town, anger flared. He's lost his mind, the eldest spat. Living out there with some orphan like she's his own blood. The younger brother hesitated. Maybe he just needs someone, he murmured. But pride ran deep in their veins, the same pride that had once poisoned their hearts against their father. They returned to the ranch, not out of concern, but out of fear that their father's strange kindness might shame their name even further. When they arrived, they found the girl feeding the horses, her bare feet covered in dust. "Get away from there," the eldest barked. She froze, startled. The cowboy stepped from the barn, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. The eldest son sneered. "You're replacing her, aren't you?" he said coldly. "Taking in strays to fill the hole you made." The air went still. The cowboy didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "This land has room for those who respect it, and none for those who don't." His tone was calm, but his words carried the weight of iron. The younger son looked between them, the bitter man his brother had become, and the quiet strength of the father he'd never understood. For the first time, doubt crept into his heart. The girl, trembling, stood behind the cowboy, clutching the edge of his coat. The eldest turned away with a curse and mounted his horse. As he rode off, the dust he left behind seemed to carry more than dirt. It carried the last of whatever respect still lingered between father and son. The younger remained, torn between pride and a truth he wasn't ready to face. The days that followed were uneasy. The younger son stayed on the ranch, helping with repairs, though his silence spoke louder than any apology. He watched his father and the native girl move through the rhythms of the day with a quiet grace he couldn't explain. The old man's patience, the girl's attentiveness. Together they created something peaceful, something whole. And it unsettled him. He had spent years believing his father incapable of tenderness. Yet here it was, not in words, but in the way the cowboy handed her a blanket when the nights grew cold, or paused his work to make sure she ate before him. One evening, as the sun melted behind the horizon, the younger son found himself standing near the corral, staring at his father. "You never looked at us like that," he said suddenly, his voice rough. The cowboy stopped, the rope in his hands falling slack. "You never let me," he replied. It wasn't anger in his tone, just truth. The son wanted to argue, but the words died in his throat. Because deep down, he knew it was true. His father had always offered love in the only way he knew how. Through labor, through sacrifice, through presence. And they had been too proud to see it. The girl listened quietly from the shadows, her dark eyes wide and full of understanding. She had never known her own father, but she recognized something sacred in the exchange, the breaking of a silence that had lasted far too long. That night, she placed a small charm at the cowboy's bedside, a token from her people, carved from wood and wrapped with a strand of her hair. It was a gift of protection, something given only to those considered family. The cowboy didn't ask what it meant. He simply kept it close. The next morning, The younger son packed his bag. "You're leaving?" the cowboy asked. The son nodded. "There's nothing for me here." But his voice trembled, revealing the lie in his words. The cowboy placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's always something, son. You just have to stop looking for it in other people's mistakes." For a long moment, neither moved. Then the son turned away, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The cowboy watched until he disappeared into the desert haze, then turned back to his chores as if nothing had changed, though his heart felt lighter somehow. The girl stood by the fence, her small hands gripping the wood. "Will he come back?" she asked softly. The cowboy nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Maybe not as a son," he said, "but someday as a man." The words hung in the air, carried off by the wind, a prayer disguised as hope. And in that moment, even the land seemed to listen. Life slowly found rhythm again. The cowboy and the girl tended the ranch with quiet devotion, side by side beneath the vast, endless sky. She had a way of softening the rough edges around him, reminding him to rest, to laugh, to see beauty in the smallest things. She'd hum songs in a language older than the mountains, and though he didn't understand the words, he felt their meaning in his bones. Sometimes he'd catch himself smiling, only to stop and stare at the ground, unsure if it was right to feel peace after so much loss. The town, however, had not forgotten. Whispers followed the cowboy wherever he went. Men questioning his sanity, women gossiping about the girl who now lived under his roof. Some said he'd lost his mind to grief. Others claimed he was trying to replace his wife. The cruelty of their words reached the girl, though she never repeated them aloud. The cowboy saw the pain in her eyes, but said nothing. He knew the West had always been harsh to those who didn't fit its mold. He'd learned long ago that the best answer to cruelty was endurance. One afternoon, as they returned from trading supplies, they found the barn door open, the horses gone, and smoke rising from a smoldering heap of hay. Vandals, likely men from town, had struck while they were away. The girl dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she tried to save what little remained. The cowboy stood still, fists clenched, the old rage stirring within him like thunder after years of silence. For a moment, he looked like the man his sons had accused him of being, broken, powerless. But then his eyes hardened. This time, he wouldn't stay quiet. He rebuilt the barn, beam by beam, refusing to let the fire define them. The girl worked beside him, her small hands blistered and raw, but her resolve fierce. Together, they worked until their bodies gave out, until the land that others tried to destroy began to breathe again. The cowboy didn't speak of revenge. Instead, he said, "You can't fight ignorance with hate. You fight it by outlasting it." And somehow, she understood. Every nail they drove into the new walls was not just for shelter. It was defiance made visible. When the structure finally stood tall again, the townsfolk passed by and stared in silence. They had expected ruin, surrender. Instead, they saw a man reborn from the ashes, a girl who refused to be erased, and a bond stronger than any rumor. The West had always been cruel, but even it bowed to resilience. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the cowboy stood in the glow of orange light, his face half shadowed, half illuminated, a symbol of both loss and rebirth. The night after the barn was rebuilt, the cowboy sat by the fire, the flames reflecting in his weary eyes. The girl slept nearby, her head resting on a folded blanket, her breathing calm. He stared into the embers, remembering his wife's laughter, his sons' voices when they were small, and the weight of all that time had taken. Yet amidst those memories, there was peace, fragile but real. For the first time since the funeral, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what he could not change, and for what he had failed to say when there was still time. But peace in the West rarely lasts long. Word of the fire reached his sons in town, twisted, exaggerated, carried by men who thrived on other people's ruin. They heard that the old man had gone mad, that he'd set the fire himself, that the native girl was no orphan but a thief who'd taken what remained of their mother's legacy. Pride and guilt, two poisons that had long simmered inside them, boiled over. The eldest slammed his glass down in the saloon, declaring, "He's disgracing her memory. I won't let him." The younger hesitated, but followed, bound by the loyalty that had destroyed them once before. The cowboy knew they were coming long before he saw the dust rise on the horizon. He felt it in the wind, in the nervous shifting of the horses, in the way silence wrapped itself around the land like a warning. He didn't tell the girl. He simply finished stacking the last of the hay, tied down the corral gate, and took a long look at the rebuilt barn. It stood there strong and proud, not just a structure, but proof that even after loss and mockery, a man could still create something that would outlast hate. By dusk, the sound of hooves filled the valley. The sons arrived with fire in their eyes, their faces hard as stone. The eldest dismounted first, his voice sharp and cold. "You've shamed us long enough, old man," he said. "The town's talking, and we won't stand for it." The cowboy stood in the doorway of the barn, his hands steady at his sides. "You lost the right to speak for this land the day you sold your mother's name," he said quietly. His words landed like bullets, each one striking the truth his sons refused to face. The younger shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking between them. "We didn't come to fight," he muttered. But the eldest's pride burned too hot. He reached for his revolver, not to fire, but to remind his father the power he thought he still held. The girl, watching from the shadows, froze. Her small voice trembled. "Please don't." The sound stopped them all, even the eldest. Her tears glistened in the fading light, just as they had at the funeral. And for a heartbeat, the valley itself held its breath. The eldest son lowered the gun slightly, his jaw tightening. "You're protecting her now?" he spat. "A stranger?" The cowboy didn't move. "No," he said. "I'm protecting what's left of your mother's heart." The words struck like thunder, simple, steady, undeniable. The air went still. The youngest son looked at the girl, then back at his father. Something inside him cracked, a truth too long buried breaking through the walls of pride. "He's not wrong," he whispered. The girl stepped forward, tears streaking her face. She held out the small charm she'd given the cowboy, the wooden token carved from her people's stories. "She cried for him," the girl said softly, "at her grave, when no one else did." Her voice trembled, but carried like a bell through the quiet. The sons froze. They remembered the day, the mocking words, the laughter, the silence. They remembered the little girl who had wept while they stood, unfeeling. And in that instant, shame came crashing down like a hammer. The eldest's hand shook as he holstered his gun. He stared at the ground, his breath uneven, the anger drained from his face, leaving only regret. "I thought you didn't care," he said finally, his voice breaking. The cowboy stepped forward, his tone soft but unyielding. "Caring isn't loud, son. Sometimes it's just staying when it hurts to stay." The younger began to cry, the sound raw and heavy, a sound years overdue. The cowboy placed a hand on his eldest son's shoulder, the same way he had once done when the boy was small and afraid of storms. "You can't undo what's been done," he said. "But you can start again." The son nodded, his throat tight with words he couldn't form. The girl wiped her eyes, her small hand gripping the cowboy's coat, as though anchoring herself to something solid, something real. That night, they sat by the fire together, the father, the sons, and the girl. No one spoke much. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic reckonings, only the quiet sound of logs cracking and the weight of forgiveness settling in the air. The cowboy looked into the flames, his heart heavy but steady. He knew there was still pain, still distance, but the worst was over. For the first time in a long time, there was peace, fragile, imperfect but real. And in the glow of the fire, the tears of a little native girl had done what pride never could. They had brought a family back from silence. The morning after their reconciliation, the ranch felt different. The lights seemed warmer, the air calmer, as though the land itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. The cowboy moved through his chores as usual, but his sons joined him now. Awkwardly at first, their movements hesitant, uncertain. They worked in silence. It was not the silence of resentment anymore, but one of rebuilding. Forgiveness doesn't arrive with fanfare. It grows quietly, like dawn spreading across the horizon. The native girl helped too, feeding the horses, carrying water, and humming softly as she worked. Her voice, fragile yet steady, filled the empty spaces between them. For the first time, the sons looked at her not as an outsider, but as something sacred, the one who had broken their pride and mended their hearts. They realized it wasn't just their father she had saved, it was all of them. Through her tears, she had shown them what true strength looked like, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't fight, but endures. At midday, they rested by the corral, the sun high and bright. The eldest son finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "We can help you fix what's left of the north pasture," he said. The cowboy looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his face. "It's already fixed," he replied. "What's broken isn't the land anymore." The son understood. The work they were doing wasn't about fences or fields. It was about stitching back together what years of pride had torn apart. Later that day, a few townsfolk rode out to the ranch, drawn by the whispers of change. They expected to find ruin or conflict, but instead, they saw a family working side by side. The silent cowboy, the sons who had once mocked him, and the girl who stood between them like a bridge. The townspeople said little, but something in the scene humbled them. The gossip that had fueled their cruelty began to fade, replaced by quiet respect. The West, so used to tales of vengeance and pride, now bore witness to something rarer: redemption without violence. That evening, as the sun sank low, the cowboy sat on the porch, the girl beside him, the sons nearby. The light bathed them all in gold, painting their faces with a softness that words could never capture. "Your mother used to say the hardest part of love is not losing it," the cowboy murmured. "It's learning to live after it's gone." His sons listened in silence. They knew now. That was what he had done all along. He hadn't stopped loving. He just carried it quietly, in the only way a man of the West knew how. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch began to thrive again. The grass grew thick, the horses strong, and laughter, something the land hadn't heard in years, returned. The girl, though small, worked like she belonged there, her spirit woven into every corner of the ranch. The cowboy's sons, once proud and distant, now found purpose in the same dirt they once rejected. Together, they built something stronger than inheritance. They built belonging. But one morning, as the sun rose pink over the mesa, the cowboy felt a weariness deeper than he'd ever known. He stood by the fence, the wind tugging at his coat, and for the first time his hands trembled. The girl noticed and ran to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice full of worry. He smiled faintly. "I'm fine, little one. Just feeling the years catch up." But deep down he knew. A man who had carried so much, loss, love, forgiveness, eventually finds his rest. And he knew his time was drawing near. That evening, he gathered them all by the fire, his sons and the girl. The flames danced between them as he spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Everything I ever lost," he said, "I found again, just not in the way I expected. I lost my land, but I found purpose. I lost my pride, but I found peace. And I lost my voice, but I found all of you." The girl began to cry quietly, and one of his sons placed a hand on her shoulder. The old man smiled at the sight. "Keep looking after each other," he whispered. "That's how you keep me here." When the fire burned low, the cowboy leaned back in his chair, hat tilted over his eyes, and fell asleep beneath the open sky. The stars shimmered above, their cold light mingling with the dying glow of the embers. The girl covered him with a blanket, whispering one last thank you, not for what he had given her, but for what he had shown her, that even a broken man could carry the kind of love that heals others. The next morning, the sons found him still sitting there, peaceful, untouched by time. The land was quiet, the wind gentle, as if the West itself was paying its respects. They buried him beside his wife on the hill, overlooking the ranch he had once lost and now regained in spirit. And as the girl placed wildflowers on his grave, the same kind she had left long ago, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the valley in light. The ranch fell silent after the cowboy's passing. His sons worked the land with heavy hearts, each sunrise reminding them of the man who had once carried their world on his shoulders. They didn't speak much of him. Words felt too small, but every task they did bore his memory. They fixed fences with care, rode horses with patience, and treated the land not as property, but as something sacred. His spirit lingered in everything, in the creak of the barn door, in the whistle of the wind through the grass, in the warmth of the fire at dusk. The native girl stayed, her presence now a constant part of their lives. She had grown from the timid child who once wept at a stranger's grave into a young woman with eyes full of wisdom far beyond her years. She tended to the house, the animals, and the graves on the hill, always leaving fresh wildflowers for the couple who had given her the home she'd never known. The sons began calling her little sister, though in truth, she was something deeper, the heart that kept their family alive when everything else had burned away. The town, once cruel and judgmental, changed too. People began to speak differently of the silent cowboy they had mocked for years. His story spread, not through gossip, but through reverence. They told of the man who never sought vengeance, who endured loss without bitterness, and whose silence had spoken more loudly than any sermon. Travelers would visit the ranch to pay respects, and many would find the girl tending the fields, her presence a living continuation of his gentleness. She never turned them away, but when asked about the man, she would always smile softly and say, "He didn't just live here. He taught the land how to forgive." One summer afternoon, while mending the corral, the eldest son found the small wooden charm the girl had once given their father. It was buried in the dust, half forgotten, yet untouched by time. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the worn grooves. Without a word, he tied it to the gatepost at the edge of the ranch, not as decoration, but as a promise that the silence his father had lived by would continue to echo through every act of kindness that followed. That night, under a sky alive with stars, the family sat around the fire once more. The girl looked at the brothers, older now, softer, and whispered, "He's still here." The eldest nodded, eyes glistening in the firelight. "He always will be," he said. "You don't bury a man like that. You just keep walking his road." And as the flames flickered, it felt as though the cowboy himself was sitting there again, hat low, eyes steady, guarding the peace he had fought his whole life to create. Years passed, and time reshaped everything except the story. The ranch grew into a refuge, a place where wanderers, orphans, and those broken by the West could find food, work, and dignity. The sons carried on their father's values, not through speeches, but through their hands. The native girl, now a woman, ran the house with quiet grace, her kindness known across the frontier. People called her the daughter of the silent man, a name she carried with pride. And whenever she spoke, her words sounded like echoes of the cowboy's voice, steady, humble, true. Visitors often asked what he had been like. Some expected tales of heroism, gunfights, or glory. But she would shake her head. "He wasn't loud," she'd say. "He didn't fight with his hands. He fought with his heart. And somehow, that made him the strongest man I ever knew." The listeners would leave in silence, humbled, as though they had glimpsed something sacred. Because in the Old West, a place where pride ruled and mercy was rare, the story of a man who won through patience was more powerful than any legend of violence. One autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted through the air, the girl climbed the hill to the graves. She knelt beside them, her fingers brushing the worn carvings of their names. "You gave me a family," she whispered. "You taught me how to live without hate." A tear rolled down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. She placed new flowers on the earth, the same wild blossoms she had left at the gate so many years before. The wind rose, soft and warm, carrying her words down the valley like a blessing. Down below, the ranch stretched wide and alive. Children playing, men working, laughter echoing against the mountains. The legacy of the silent cowboy was everywhere, not in wealth, not in monuments, but in the spirit of those who had learned to love without fear. His silence had become their song. His stillness had become their strength. And every generation that followed carried his story not as a burden, but as a light. At dusk, as the sun sank behind the hills, the girl stood at the fence and looked toward the horizon. The sky burned gold, the same color it had the day he died. She closed her eyes, and in the hush of twilight, she heard it again, the faint sound of hooves, the whisper of the wind, and a voice, calm and familiar, saying, "Keep riding, little one." She smiled through her tears, because in that moment, she knew legends never die. They just ride farther than the rest of us can see. Time softens the harshest lands, but some stories never fade. The tale of the silent cowboy lived on, not as a legend of gunfire or glory, but as a quiet echo of what it truly means to love, to forgive, and to endure. His strength was never in his words or his fists. It was in the way he carried his pain with grace and turned silence into wisdom. In a world that often mistakes noise for power, his stillness became eternal, a reminder that dignity speaks loudest when the heart chooses peace over pride. The ranch he left behind became a living memory of him. Every nail, every fence, every wildflower that grew on the hill whispered his story. The sons who once mocked their father found purpose in his example, learning that redemption is not found in apologies, but in change. And the native girl, the child who once cried for a stranger, became the keeper of his name, a bridge between the past and all the hearts that would someday need his lesson. Through her, the cowboy silence became a song that never stopped playing. People who came to the ranch seeking answers never found grand speeches or monuments. They found something far greater, a feeling, a sense of calm, of purpose, of quiet strength that seemed to breathe through the land itself. They'd leave changed, carrying with them an unspoken truth, that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with bullets, but with forgiveness, not in the streets, but within the human heart. And in that sense, the silent cowboy had won every war that mattered. His story reminds us that loss is not the end. It's an invitation to rebuild differently. That love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly, waiting to be seen. And that the ones who carry their burdens without bitterness teach the world more about courage than any victory ever could. So if you've ever been mocked for staying silent, or misunderstood for choosing peace, remember this man. Because silence in the right hands is not weakness. It's strength refined by pain and purified by love. If this story touched your heart, share what it meant to you in the comments. Leave a like if you felt the message, and subscribe to walk with us through more tales from the Old West. Stories where every scar tells a truth, every silence hides a lesson, and every soul learns that even in the loneliest places, love never truly dies.